The opinions expressed in the following programs are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of Rogers Cable or Rogers TV.
Good evening, everyone. If you're milling about, if you could take your seats, we'll start in just a few moments. I'm Darren White. I am the Warden of Dufferin County, and on behalf of Dufferin County Council, I welcome you all to tonight's Past Promises, Present Realities event in commemoration of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Before we begin tonight's important conversation, I'll provide an acknowledgement of the land and territory of Indigenous peoples in Dufferin County. So we'd like to begin tonight by respectfully acknowledging that Dufferin County resides within the traditional territory and ancestral lands of the Tianantati, the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabe peoples. We also acknowledge that various municipalities within the County of Dufferin reside within the treaty lands named under the Haldeman Deed of 1784 and two of the Williams Treaties of 1818. Treaty 18, the Nottawasaga Purchase, and Treaty 19, the Adjutant's Treaty. These traditional territories upon which we live and learn are steeped in rich Indigenous history and traditions. It is with this statement that we declare to honor and respect the past and present connection of Indigenous peoples with this land, its waterways, and resources. Now, if you please join me in welcoming Sonia Pritchard, Chief Administrative Officer for the County of Dufferin, and she will introduce our speaker tonight. Sonia.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight at the county's Past Promises, Present Realities event in commemoration of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. My name is Sonia Pritchard, and I am the Chief Administrative Officer at Dufferin County. It is my honor to provide an introduction for our speaker this evening, Dr. Taiaiake Alfred. Dr. Alfred is a Gananagwe Mohawk, philosopher, writer, and political strategist with over 3 decades of experience in First Nations governance, politics, and cultural restoration and environmental impact assessment. He served as an infantryman in the United States Marine Corps, and after a 25-year academic career during which he founded Indigenous programs at Concordia University and the University of Victoria and originated Indigenous resurgence as an intellectual paradigm, he left academia to devote himself to working directly with his own and other First Nations people at the community level, to breathe life into ancestral visions of nationhood. Dr. Alfred is an Inspire National Aboriginal Achievement Award laureate in the field of education. He holds a PhD from Cornell University and is the author of 4 books: Heeding the Voices of Our Ancestors and Peace, Power, Righteousness from Oxford University Press, Wasaze Indigenous Pathways of Action and Freedom, and most recently, It's All About the Land, collected talks and interviews on Indigenous resurgence from the University of Toronto Press. And I believe that is the book right back there. So if you'd like to pick up a copy before you go. He presently leads the Gananagwe Governance Project, a community initiative to restore traditional government, and is the senior advisor on the Indigenous initiatives at McGill University. It is our honor to have Dr. Alfred here with us tonight to provide us with a First Nations perspective on the roots and dynamics of the Indigenous-state relationship, and to initiate constructive dialogue on the ways the county and Canadians can contribute to the resurgence of First Nations people and embody Canada's legal commitment to the principles of reconciliation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Taiaiake Alfred.
Got a mic there. Please, Sonia.
No, sorry, I know I said your name.
Oh, no, it's okay. Sego, it's going to go away. Very good to be here. Thank you for that introduction, Sonia. Maybe you can turn the volume down a little bit. Thank you for that introduction and for the welcome. And I just have to say, it's the first time that I'm in Orangeville. I feel really good. People have made me feel really welcome, and I feel like this is going to be a good conversation. And I don't know what people were expecting, a speech, a fiery speech to get you riled up or anything like that, but given the people and the energy that I'm feeling, I think that the best use of our time could be me presenting some ideas, giving you this perspective that I have, and then we can have a conversation. We can have a dialogue going back and forth on some of the issues that you might have in your mind about this whole concept of reconciliation and where it's headed and what you can do as a person, as an organization, as a community. And hopefully I can make a contribution to that work that you are doing to really bring Canada around to a position where we can actually say collectively that we have some justice in this country as it pertains to Indigenous people. That's what I'm hoping to achieve tonight with you. And so with that, I just wanted to say, I have one other connection to Orangeville, because I know I'm being recorded here and people are going to be watching it.
You're not in Orangeville, okay?
Fred, thank you, Fred. Okay, I'm not in Orangeville, I'm in Mono. Shelburne. See, I already have a whole bunch of debates going on, because one person said I'm in Mono, one person said I'm in Shelburne, one person said I'm in Orangeville. No. I do have a connection to Orangeville because I'm from Kahnawake. And for those of you watching that are lacrosse fans, I'm a big lacrosse fan and a big lacrosse person. We know that our Kahnawake Mohawks have made a significant contribution to the success of your team, the Northwest. So my best friend's son was one of the stars, Colton Markey, for those of you that follow lacrosse, and another young star lacrosse player from our community who we're very proud of was the top player on the junior Northman Trade Year. So I'm from that community, so I feel like I have a connection. Also, I believe in ancient times and hundreds of years ago, Huron people were inhabiting this area, and this is territory of Huron, Wendat Nation, and so forth. And I know a lot of people think, those that study history and those that look at history, that there was this titan conflict between the Iroquois and the Hurons, and the Iroquois are often cast in Canadian history as the people who came and did the Hurons in, and the Hurons were no more. But in fact, I just want you to know, I have a strong connection to this land because most of the Huron people, aside from the Huron Nation in that era of conflict that resulted in the dissolution of the Huron Nation and the spreading out of their people to different areas from their original homeland here, the nation suffered, but the people themselves were adopted into our community. Thousands of Huron women and children were adopted into the Mohawk and the Onondaga nations. So I have a lot of Huron blood flowing through me, and I'm happy to be here to be able to contribute to the work that we're doing here, to bring some justice, like I said, to the present day, but also to make sure that people understand the history of the land that they're living on. And I think that that's a big part of what reconciliation is. A lot of times people ask me in the work that I do, what is reconciliation? What's the point? Like, what can I do, and so forth. And I always step back, take a step back and say, well, the first thing is to really understand the history of the land that you're on and the flow of history that you were a part of. However you came to this land, you are now a part of the flow of that history. You know, there was ancient peoples. People lived here for thousands of years. Now we live here and we inhabit it here. How are we connected to that? And how are we connected to the good and the bad things that have happened in that history? And for me, when I think about reconciliation, I really think about the phases of this country. You know, and when I think about reconciliation, I'm thinking about this current era, this current posture in regard to how Canada sees itself in relation to First Nations people, how Canada sees itself, how Canadians are coming to see themselves in relation to this land. And that's something that we're all involved in. We're all trying to understand it. We're all trying to make a positive contribution. We're all trying to create justice in this framework of reconciliation. Prior to that, of course, we lived in a different era where Canadians, Canada as a country, had a completely different posture and set of objectives and even attitude towards First Nations people. And I think we need to start the conversation there. It's a bit of a downer, you know, when you're thinking about positivity, but we are dealing with truth and reconciliation, right? And so we cannot skip that first part, the truth and reconciliation. Truth is something I think that we all have to understand, because the idea of the relationship between First Nations and newcomers, or First Nations and Canadians, has evolved over time. And I think that over time, Canadians have gotten confused about what the issue is with First Nations. You know, when you look at it, if you talk to people in conversation, or if you look at different things that have been written, there's different ways that people posture themselves in relation to First Nations and define the problem that we're trying to resolve through reconciliation. And that really determines, I think, how much possibility there is to achieve justice. Because the way that we look at the problem is, of course, going to shape the type of solutions that we're working for and the framing of what justice is going to be like. And up until very recently, Canada has framed the problem in terms of the native person, and to use the language that's been used in the past, the Indian being the problem. The Indian problem was actually a phrase, a term, a framing that has been used over many years to look at what the issues are in regard to First Nations people and the Canadian state. The Indian problem. And the Indian problem basically has two basic components to it, this whole framing, this ideology of the Indian being a group of people that stand as an obstacle to the development or the evolution of this society. So the problem was that the European societies came over to this part of the world. They had an idea of themselves. They had an idea of what their future was going to be. They had a set of objectives. They had a vision of what this land was, and it was driven by philosophies and books and ideas and ideologies that came out of European thought and European religion and European society. And they came here and they found that there was no consistency at all between the people that were here, the reality that they found, and what they believed about this land. They believed that it was an empty land. The concept of terra nullius, in Latin, empty land, is the foundational concept for European settlement over here. It's the thing that allowed European societies to establish themselves with some sort of self-rationalized legality. So when they came here, they had this idea from Europe that this was empty land, terra nullius. Now, from the northern part of this continent all the way down to the south, they found, in fact, on the ground, in reality, civilizations, societies, laws, people, and so forth, that had no consistency with what was in the Bible or what was in the teachings that they got about peoples in other parts of the world and so forth. And we have the first Indian problem. Indian problem being, this doesn't match up with what my Bible tells me. This does not match up with what I have been told I will find here, which is maybe a few bands of scattered uncivilized people, but certainly not temples, mound builder societies, great civilizations with philosophy and music and so forth. And we have the first, in my view, tragedy of history, and that rather than engage this reality on a respectful terms, rather than engage this reality in an attempt to create something that was going to be generative of a new society, of a different way of being and so forth, from top to bottom, from north to south, the European societies tried to erase that reality as opposed to engage with it in a respectful way. So right off the bat, the Indians were a problem because rather than give up the word from Europe to accord with the reality on the ground, they went to extreme lengths. Physical removal, intellectual erasure, and so forth and so on. They carried on from as soon as they were able to start doing it up until very recently. And one of the things that we mark Orange Shirt Day with in respect of, one of the things that we acknowledge and so forth is really connected to that long tradition of trying to remove the reality of indigenous civilization, law, government, and so forth from being an obstacle to the development of a European vision of what society is in this land and the displacement of that. So we have that Indian problem defined in that way, which started hundreds of years ago, and which I would argue is still manifesting in a lot of ways in the society today. The other aspect of this Indian problem is what it does to the creation of the idea of what it is to be a First Nations person or an Indigenous person. Because over the course of history, of course, we're living in a society that was triumphant in their effort to erase, in their effort to displace, in their effort to create something different and to supplant those civilizations, those societies, and so forth. We're all living in that reality. And so what is it in that reality in terms of a perspective on the people that were here first that we've inherited? What we've inherited is a view of the Indian, the Indigenous person, as a victim of history. Victimhood. Indian problem being, even if you take the position of you're looking at that colonial history, which I've just described, in negative terms and not validating it and critiquing it and coming at it from a position of justice and so forth, which many people do, I acknowledge. In fact, probably most people in the society today look at it in those terms. I don't think there's really been a full investigation or consideration of how that process and how the acceptance of this society's just evolution and so forth, even though it has had hiccups or dark periods and things like that, how that has shaped people's view of the Native person. And I think that that's another aspect of the Indian problem that really needs to be focused on when we're talking about digging for the truth, getting to the truth, because I think that the society is still postured towards First Nations people generally looking at them as victims of history or failing to keep up with the progress of society. And so when you're looking at problems in regard to Indigenous peoples, it's easy to look at the problem in terms of Native people's disorganization or Native people's pathology, social or psychological, the impacts of colonialism and so forth. And I'm not saying these things are not real. I'm not saying these things are not things that need to be addressed and worked on and validated and respected as factors in people's lives. But if that's all Native people is an obstacle to the development of the perfect Euro-American society and victims who have been left behind that need to be brought into that society and taken out of this status of being the victim that has not benefited from the products of this highly developed society that we have now and that we're all benefiting from, we have a big problem because that's a very selective truth. It's like a narrow slice of the truth. And these things that I'm describing here and sort of casting the relationship in colonial terms and looking at it through this colonial lens and so forth really downplays or even ignores the central reality from the perspective of First Nations in terms of what was the point of all of these policies, what was the objective, what was the central purpose of the policies, the laws, the actions of this larger society in attempting to take, what do I mean? Well, they took Native people's culture. They took Native people's government. They took Native people's land. And that act of dispossession, of deculturation, and denial of legitimacy, from a First Nations perspective, that's the problem. So we have competing realities here in terms of the way that we define what the problem is that we're trying to solve today. When we're thinking about the past, unfortunately, I think most people still cast the Natives in one of either the victim mode or the ones that they got left behind and couldn't keep up, or as obstacles still, obstacles to progress. From a First Nations perspective, we're looking at it in the sense that all these things were done in the service of colonialism. That the real problem is the fact that we are not able to live under our own laws in our own land according to our own culture. And that other people are benefiting from this land, benefiting from our ancestral birthright, and we are denied access to that, and we are denied the status that we have as nations of people. We're denied the benefits of nationhood. And here's where we get to another kind of aspect of truth and untruth in what we're looking at. Because no matter what your perspective on these things, if we're trying to reconcile and we're trying to create justice coming out of all of this history that I'm speaking about, if we don't focus on the fact that the Canadian government over the years put in all these policies, whether it was residential schools, the theft of lands, the denial of Native peoples' government rights, the fact that they weren't allowed to have lawyers organized to address their land claims up until 1972, all of those things, if we keep out of the picture, if we don't really focus on the fact that Native people see themselves, they saw themselves and they still see themselves as members of nations of people in relation to other people, then we're actually still participating in a colonial perspective, even if we want to help those individual people. So this is a perfect opportunity to talk about how the need to dig deeper to the truth is absolutely essential to justice. Because if reconciliation in the way that we've conceived it today is successful, of course, it's going to result in addressing the individual harms of people that went to residential school. It's going to be very oriented towards creating opportunities for individuals like myself, like other individual First Nations people and Métis and Inuit people in this country, to access the benefits of this society. It's going to be less overtly racist terminologically, and people are going to be more open and more respectful in their engagements with Indigenous people. But all of these things are going to focus on the individual harms of colonization, the traumas that people have endured in their lives and families have endured in their lives as a result of colonial processes and laws and the treatment of individuals by society. And so these are things that are being addressed quite, I would say, effectively these days. I was a critic of reconciliation when it first was proposed, 20 years ago. I'm still a critic, but in a different way now. When it was first proposed, I was adamantly against it, saying, why are you focusing just on the individual? This is a collective problem. This is a colonial problem. This is not a problem of Native peoples, referencing back again to my historical framing of individuals. It's not individual trauma, it's these things. But what was the reason that residential schools were put in place? There's all kinds of different answers to that question, but from a First Nations perspective, in this framing that I'm trying to persuade you to look at the problem through, residential schools were part of a vast infrastructure of colonialism to dispossess Native peoples. And so the individual harms that were suffered are one thing, but the actual collective harm of dispossession from our lands and denial of our nationhood and deculturation of our people, that is the first level harm. That is the upper level harm. And if we have a concept of reconciliation that only addresses those individual harms and in fact pushes away discussion and denies that necessary process of digging at the truth for the collective harm and looking at those policies and those actions that resulted in the denial of our nationhood, then we're recolonizing through reconciliation, which is an ugly thought for most people. As most people I understand people having a sincere effort to want to have a just country. They do want to. They do not want to inherit the colonialism that their ancestors practiced and believed in. If I asked anybody to stand up and say, do you believe in, I used to do this in class, by the way, but how many of you actually believe that you are superior because you have fair skin and your ancestors are from Europe. No one's going to stand up today and say that. I don't know, no one in this room, I'm positive of that, but very few people will do that. Well, no one did, so, you know, when nobody wants to be the person who is standing on that racist colonial history. But it's my job, and I think the job of First Nations intellectuals and our allies in the community, to be able to show people that even if you don't want to, unfortunately, you are, because we still have an Indian Act, we still have the denial of native land rights, we still have the basics of that colonial policy being practiced today and manifested and defended very strongly by the Canadian government at that collective level. And so you can see how they've taken the harms and made them individual harms. And they've moved and shifted discussion away from collective harms. And this is a sort of recent phenomenon. You know, I don't know how many of you remember 1990, conflict in my nation, in the Mohawk Nation, and it was spreading all over the country and so forth. I was, like all of you, younger. I was a young man then. I was 24 years old, and one of my jobs at that time was to help our chiefs in organizing support. People come into our community and organizing support. And I had one of the biggest learning experiences I've ever had. We had a giant meeting and all these chiefs from all over Canada came, all these elders and chiefs, very strong orators and thinkers and so forth. And I got to listen to them for a few days, internally talk. And all of the talk at that time was about our nations, our treaties, our lands. Yeah, it was about, this is an attack on our nationhood. And the objective, of course, in our solidarity being to have Canada respect our collective existence and to take that step back and to look at that foundation that Canada was built on of treaties and nation-to-nation relationship and force Canada to respect that. And that was the framing of what the problem was and what our movement was about. That was in 1990. If I go, which I have gone to national gatherings today, the Assembly of First Nations, or if I go to academic conferences and so forth, it's completely shifted. And this is among our own people. And I know it's a reflection of how the discussion and the dialogue and the discourse has evolved over time in this country. So from 1990 to 2024, if I go into a forum now of First Nations leaders or of intellectuals, like I said, and so forth, the talk is about colonial trauma, but there's very little, and there's great programs addressing that, right? There's language programs, there's healing programs, and all these sorts of things, and I'm not meaning to disparage any of that work or anything like that, but there's very, very little talk, if any, of land claims, of our traditional governments, of the dispossession and of treaties and so forth. It's all, again, focused. And so the discourse has changed. And so I, of course, among Indigenous people are making these same arguments in a different way, saying, you know, we need to get back on track. But I'm also here in the non-Indigenous public trying to get people to see that justice can't be achieved unless we focus on that. That in fact, it's another form of injustice to continue to individualize colonialism. And so when we're thinking about what reconciliation is, it has to be in those terms. And then what's the solution? So reconciliation, I think one of the challenges of what I'm putting out there, people intellectually and thinking about their reaction, you know, when they hear all this, one of the challenges is, well, what's the solution? You know, it's kind of, it's not easy, but we can think of a solution if we keep that individualized trauma perspective and colonization as an individual harm perspective, because we have therapeutic practices, we have compensation through money, we have increased opportunities for employment, for education. We have all mechanisms to invite people in and allow them as individuals to empower themselves. Right? And I'm not denying that at all. But when it comes to the collective, it's a lot harder to think about what is the solution, or is there even a pathway at this point in this country to address those collective harms, which I'm arguing are at the root of the injustice in this country. Luckily for us, there's a framing for Canada in relation to First Nations that is just as old as Canada, even before Canada existed. Even before Canada existed, there was nation-to-nation respectful relationships between the peoples that were here and that came here and the original peoples. Treaties. There was a slogan in the 70s, in the 80s, honor the treaties. It was very simple. You know, what was the problem in Native communities? What was the problem? They're not honoring the treaties. They fraudulently took control of our land. They deny our chiefs and clan mothers authority. They won't let us speak our language. And they're disregarding the treaties. Nobody talks that way anymore. That's what I'm trying to change. And I think that, you know, we really need to think about Canada in terms of what are the foundational principles that this country has been built on, and honor those. Because that is the pathway to justice. Because these other things that are being tried in terms of pathways to address the harms of colonization through the methods and through the idea of reconciliation that we're practicing now are having a modicum of success, but they're not really transforming Indigenous communities into places and spaces and families and communities that are healthy and that can sustain themselves going forward in the next couple of generations. They're creating individuals that are in their varying degrees capable of taking advantage of the incentives that are there, but as communities, as collectivities, they're falling further and further behind in every indicator of health. And so that's something to consider. This is an opportunity for Canada to really look at what the root of the problem is. So the root of the problem is the fact that, like any other human community, a given First Nation needs to have land. They need to have land base. They need to have the ability to practice their culture and for it to be passed on intergenerationally. They have to have the ability to govern themselves and to make decisions for themselves that are to the benefit of their own people. These are things that, for the most part, Indigenous people still today in this country are denied. Most people in this country that live in a Native community, in a First Nations community, live in communities that are still governed according to the rules, the priorities, and the culture of a people that are different than themselves. This, logically speaking, would not be a problem if those people had the best intentions. If the colonizer came with the best intentions, but we all know that that's not the case, because from an Indigenous perspective, we are that problem. Beyond that, from an Indigenous perspective, there is still the commitment to hold on to that difference, to hold on to that root, to hold on to that authentic Indigenous reality of their ancestors. So it's been put to me before, the way that I understood it best is somebody explained it in that, in spite of colonization, when they came and they took our land, they thought that would be the end of us. But no, we still had our government. And then they did away with our government. They attacked it, they outlawed it, they divided and conquered and got rid of it. And then they thought, well, that's going to be the end of them. No, they still had their language. They still had their cultural traditions and so forth. They attacked those, and they got rid of those. They dispersed it. Then they thought, well, what else is there? But there is something else. It's that sense, and it's that belief, and it's that identity of being Ongwehue in our language in Mohawk, which is the original people of this land. And so we're dealing with the issue now of a problem where all of those things have been undermined, but yet people still believe that they have the right to those things in their own territory. And the psychology of that is the psychology of native existence. So we're talking about past realities, now we're talking about present realities. So the psychology of native life today really centers around a frustration and not being able to live out the vision of your ancestors, not being able to live out what you know is your authentic way of life. We are taught increasingly, I'm happy to say, because languages have survived and there's been a cultural revitalization in the last few years and so forth, increasingly even in our own language, that to be Mohawk or to be Anishinaabe or to be Cree is this, and there's ceremonies, there's a philosophy, there's principles, there's ideas that go into that. Beyond that, there's sacred places and there's territory and there's land. And these are the things that make you Ongwe. But yet, think about this problem of that person living on a reserve or in the city with really no access to living that out. No access to be able to live out the existence, which is the only one they are told is true to them. And there you have that psychological disjuncture. And you have the discord within individuals that causes them to act out in all kinds of different ways, politically, personally, pathologically, and so forth. So for me, all these years on a personal level and trying to understand this and live through it and negotiate it, and also as a scholar and as a person working in the community, trying to make things better for our community, trying to get justice and so forth, I understand it very clearly in these terms, in the sense that there's an individual aspect, but this collective harm and the need to restore traditional governments, to have an honest and respectful resolution on the land issue, and to support intensive restoration of language and cultural practices is the root of justice. And that is the pathway, in my mind, to the achievement of a situation in this country where we could stand once again, eye to eye, respectfully, and have our hands out and shake hands and say, okay, now we're in a relationship of justice. And I referenced it a few minutes ago. I do have faith that there is a solution to this, because it has been something that was the reality in the past. You know, if there were no treaties, that is the collective heritage of all of us sitting in this room, if there were no treaties that our ancestors made together to make this country, where we all agreed to be in this space as respected equals together, then we would be in a situation like many other countries, unfortunately, are in, where you have groups of people that have no shared history, no shared set of principles, no heritage of cooperation and peaceful coexistence, that are just vying for territory. One from a denied perspective and one from a superior perspective. How many countries can we name that are in this situation? Canada is in a different situation. I never hold back on my criticisms of this country, but I also acknowledge the possibilities that we have that are fairly unique in the world, in the sense that this country doesn't exist outside of a treated relationship of peaceful coexistence between First Nations and the newcomer society. The constitutional history of this country is rooted in treaties. Every nation in this territory has a treaty where newcomers to the territory reached out, where peace was made on a respectful basis, promises were made back and forth, and that was the foundation of that relationship, and people developed from there. Now, from that period, of course, things went sideways. When Canada was formed and the numerical superiority of the newcomer society allowed the governors of this society to disregard those treaties and to impose a completely counterfactual version of history upon this land that erase Native people and the promises that were made from the Canadian consciousness? Unfortunately, they did. That's the truth. That's another aspect of the truth that we're trying to deal with here. So again, history has an answer to the problem that we're facing. The problem is that governments are unwilling to accept the reality that they are not dealing with people in these Native communities who are citizens of Canada of a different ethnicity that have some connection to an Aboriginal past. They're not dealing with that. They're dealing with citizens of nations to which Canada has made promises that are laws in international law. And Canada has broken those promises. Canada has broken international law. And we need to address it on those terms. So when you're thinking about what the problem is that we're dealing with in reconciliation, hopefully I'm laying out a vision here that shows that that individual addressing of harm is the surface level. Below it is the iceberg. And the iceberg is made up of land rights, traditional government, Native government rights, and the restoration of our culture. This is a situation that every nation is in this country. And so we have an idea that has developed to counter the idea of reconciliation, but not, and I want to make it clear, not to throw out the idea of reconciliation per se and say that it's a bad thing, like we shouldn't be holding hands in friendship. That's not what I'm saying at all. But reconciliation as it has been developed and put into practice in a legal framework as a policy of the government, which is basically a smokescreen to prevent people from getting to the actual root of the problem that I'm outlining here. That's what we are all participating in, wittingly or unwittingly. I would say most people unwittingly, because most people are responding to the emotional and intellectual disjuncture and turmoil that they feel when they come to understand their country as having practiced these things on Native children, families, and so forth. I understand the emotion of that. I live among non-Native people, and I talk, and I have friends, and so forth, and I understand the impact of residential schools, and especially after the Kamloops revelations, that really kickstarted people into thinking about this issue and caring about this issue on an emotional level, on a spiritual level even. And so I understand that. So I'm not dismissing reconciliation in that sense as having no value or anything. In fact, it's absolutely essential. But what I'm trying to do is link it to the legal and political struggles of First Nations, which most people tend to disregard or to actually take stances against. Because people still have the colonial mentality, call it for what it is, the colonial mentality of thinking that Canada is a peaceful, good country that just made a few mistakes. Canada is a country, like many others, that has made a lot of mistakes, that has been, at various points in its history, driven by very evil forces manifesting in laws and policies. That's a fact that we all have to accept and understand. But we are now moving into a position where we want to address that and create a different Canada. If we think about it that way, if we think about wanting to create a different Canada, not fix the natives, not bring the natives forward to where we all are, if we acknowledge that the situation shifted between the linking arms together era, when the Europeans needed us, First Nations, when they needed our land, when they needed our knowledge, when they needed our labor, when they needed us in every respect, to the Canadian era and the nation-building era, when demographics shifted and power shifted and technology shifted and so forth, and we weren't needed. Our labor wasn't needed, our people weren't needed, our military wasn't needed. We were denied, erased, and suppressed. And now we're living in a different era. That's the way I like to think about it. Now we're living in a different era where people want to take that and own it and look at it not only that second layer, I would say, but also the positivity in the first layer, where there was a demonstration of a capacity on the part of this country to engage First Nations in a respectful way. How many people know that this country would never exist without Mohawks? I know my friend here does. If you follow him on Facebook, you'll know that, he has a lot to say about that. But I use this as an illustrative point, and I talk about it often because people think of Mohawks. You can be honest. When you hear Mohawks, you're like, warrior society, 1990, bunch of troublemakers, this and that. True, but also strongly committed to maintaining that treaty relationship and upholding the commitments that we've made in the treaties that we have with the newcomer societies. Just in my own one community of Kahnawake, I think we over 100 treaties. There's a recent court case where we presented to the Superior Court of Quebec our justification for our economic practices in treaty terms, and we'd pick 10 treaties out of all of those 100, just the strongest ones, and put them forward, just to illustrate the fact that there's this extensive history of respect for ourselves in the way that we see ourselves throughout the history of the development of this country. And I say there wouldn't be a Canada without Mohawks. Well, the Battle of Beaver Dams, pretty much Laura Secord, for those of you that don't know, Laura Secord, battle down there. Who won that battle? And who saved Canada? Laura Secord had a role, but I can tell you there was probably close to 500 Kahnawake Mohawk warriors that were there under the command of John Norton, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong, somebody watching the TV, but they won that battle. There was a number of other battles in the War of 1812. There was another battle, the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, and the Battle of Quebec. Who was responsible for the British winning that? Who played a big part in that? Kahnawake Mohawks. I can go down the line, and I'm just focusing on my own nation, my own community. Native people, First Nations, have given their lives for these treaties. They still defend these treaties in principle and in practice as sacred things. That's how we live our lives in relation to Canada. And Native people's view of the injustice is all those other harms that were caused by colonial policies and residential schools and so forth. But their view of the harm is the fact that those treaties are broken every single day. And they're like, our ancestors fought and died so that that country can exist. And as soon as that country was able to throw them in the trash bin of history, they did. And I'm not talking about just historians or nerds who read history. I'm talking about everybody who's a politically conscious being in First Nations communities. That's the way they see this country. And so when we're thinking about what to do about it, it has to be in that framing. It has to be in that framework. And this idea that I tried to develop in the work that I've done over the last few years, articulated in this book. This book is basically a collection of speeches and engagements like this and interviews over the last, since 2005, really, trying to articulate a critique of reconciliation, trying to outline an idea of what would be a path forward that takes the best instincts of reconciliation, critiques it effectively, and asks people to really leave behind that colonial framing and then step into a space where we're able to regenerate that existence of a treaty-based nation-to-nation respect between our people. What do we do? And so that's what this book is really about. It's almost a 20-year journey on a collective and personal level to try to think through these things in reflecting on relationships that have developed, pathways that have been followed governmentally, legally, and in terms of community development and so forth, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, and so forth. And so it's a reflection on all of that. But the idea that's emerged from that, and it was said in the introduction, resurgence. It's a term, it's a way of thinking about what the alternative is to reconciliation. So if reconciliation is not the ideal framing today, because it's been co-opted by government agendas to be something that maintains the essence of colonialism and just gives the surface of liberation from colonialism, if that's what it is, it's not inherently that, but that's what it's become. What is the alternative? Well, the alternative is a set of practices that we're calling resurgence, which involve communities, the country as a whole, but primarily allies, primarily though, indigenous peoples themselves committing to restore and reconnect where they have been disconnected from the sources of their identity, their power, their strength, and their existence. So this kind of comes to a conception of what colonization is. Aside from all of these other things and the hours and years we can start talking about specific policies and laws and so forth, when you think about it, and after 30 years of thinking about it, I say, it's really about a disconnection of us from who we are. It's disconnecting us. It's a severance. And all those things, the dispossession from our land, the taking away of our chief and clan mother system, our traditional government system, the taking away of our tongue and our language, the creation of a false image, a facsimile of what it is to be Ongwehue, as opposed to us living our true existence. We've been cut off from our true existence, not by our own choice, by the actions of government and by the acquiescence of the population of this country, because it benefits them materially. It's a hard truth to have to accept. That's the reality. So, if it's disconnection, if it's severance, well, the answer is reconnection. Yeah, reconnection. So, this is something that our communities have committed to. Our communities are committed to reconnecting to their language, reconnecting to their history, reconnecting to their culture, reconnecting to the land, land-based practices, land-based education, land-based learning, living in relation to the natural environment in the way that our ancestors did, connecting to our traditional forms of government. The work that I do in my own community of Kahnawake right now, I'm very proud to say, after years of working in different environments and with different political agendas and so forth, is centrally focused on the restoration of our traditional governing system in opposition to the Indian Act system that was imposed on us, which has been imposed on us to keep us divided so that those objectives of the state can continue to operate in our territory. And it's all beginning to work. It's all beginning to come together. The younger people that I work with, I'm not a fluent speaker of Taiaiake, my language, because I grew up in that era when it was denied and suppressed, and I never had the chance to connect to it. I know a bit through my own learning, but I have 3 people who are assisting me on this project, and they're all 30 and under. All 3 of them, they all are fluent. They speak Taiaiake. All of the people that I have worked with in this process of reconstituting our government system, they are knowledgeable. They have been, from the time they're little kids, they know our systems, they know our philosophies, they know our languages and so forth. Then it takes it to that next level, because once you know that, they start to understand, well, the central teaching isn't just some abstract thing. It isn't just some theory about how to engage with the natural environment and so forth. You actually have to go and do it. And they begin to create new relationships with the natural environment, i.e., they become vehicles for healing the natural environment, for restoring the health of the land and the waters in our territory. They then become, in a collective sense, vehicles for teaching other communities how to do that as well, and to get them and to bring them into this collective effort to do those things, to restore the strength and the power of the individual and of the family, families getting healed, relationships getting addressed, and so forth. So this idea isn't just a romantic or theoretical thing about back to the land, you know, people talk about. This is finding out about what does that actually mean. That actually being Ongwehue in our language is all about our relationships practiced according to the natural law and the philosophies that our ancestors developed that allowed them to sustain themselves in this land for thousands of years. So thousands of years they lived in, I want to say in harmony, not to say that no wars were ever practiced. I started off talking about how Hurons and us were like this at periods of time, but they were able to sustain societies here for many thousands of years, and they were able to create social communities and political spaces where people were valued, respected to a degree that has yet to be achieved in any other type of political system. The motivation for the American democratic system was the Haudenosaunee. I am not taking credit for America and American politics by saying that. It was aspirational. They looked at the status of women. They looked at the way children were treated. They looked at the equality. They looked at the decision-making process. They looked at their ability to resolve conflict without decimating wars. And they said, we want some of that. Of course, they messed it all up. But the acknowledgement was there that that was something worth emulating. And I think that we're back there again. You know, we're back there again because now we've kind of come to a point in history where that whole idea of progress that left us behind, that overconfident European philosophy that said we know the way, liberal capitalism, consumerist society, we are building this and it's going to be the epitome. It's going to be the apex. It's going to be the end of history, as one philosopher put it. You know, it's going to be the conclusion. We're finding out that that's not actually the end result of those philosophical principles in practice. Climate change, pollution, wars, disruption of communities, and drug crises, and all these sorts of things. Aside from all the material good, aside from the benefits of progress, the technological advancement and stuff, there's that. And the central thing is the inability of the society to sustain itself in a natural environment, which is nothing to dismiss. I don't know if there's a technological solution to capitalism and its natural evolution to where we're headed. That's what the climate crisis is really all about. I mean, Rachel Carson warned of this in the 70s. You know, you can't really count on this system going forever. It's going to exhaust resources and it's going to cause massive problems, to put the argument simply. Now, where are we going to get the answers to this? We're grasping. We're trying to find from within the philosophies that are in existence today, out of Europe, out of America, out of our own thinking and so forth, solutions to this. But I would put forward, we're back where we started in history, because the indigenous environmental ethic is having the power to actually address the substantial crisis that we're facing now in terms of how do human beings relate to each other and how do human beings relate in the natural environment in a way which allows human beings to continue to exist. Because right now we've been relating for the last 200 years in a way that allows us to have a giant party before we all extinguish ourselves. And if that's what you're into, then indigenous philosophy has nothing to offer, you know, because it's about a completely different ethic in terms of relationship to the natural environment and each other. But if you are into the survival of our species, then I think that we have an opportunity to connect on another level. So the native people are connecting and strengthening themselves and creating that ability to survive and address the harms of colonization We have massive problems where we still have the multi-generational trauma and all this stuff playing itself out. But I think we found the way. And in every instance where this idea of resurgence has been put into practice in families, by individuals and families and by communities, it's made a meaningful difference in people's lives, and it's actually created realities that people want to be part of. And I think that's an important thing. People want to be part of these realities that are being created in different nodes all around. So that to me is showing that it is a hopeful vision. But the one area that it hasn't really connected on yet, except on individual levels between people when we have conversations, is on that ability to connect indigenous environmental ethics and philosophies with government policy and with decisions that are made on a collective level by people who have control over resources and law and policy in this country. That to me is the next level, because right now the society, as we all know, and I'll say it again just to make the point, is headed in a direction where it's nihilist. It's a nihilist vision. There's really no group or philosopher or organization that has a solution for the problems that we're facing. And to me, we need to make that connection. And it's not just the Mohawks, and it's not just the Anishinaabe, and it's not just the Dene. This is indigenous peoples globally. Indigenous peoples who still live the lives according to the principles that all of our ancestors did. You know, it wasn't that long ago that people in Ukraine and people in Ireland and people in Japan, their ancestors were living indigenous lives themselves. But industrialization in the modern society has removed them from that and erased that memory. So here's the other hopeful part of being Canadian. Not only do we have a history of treaties to be able to have a framework for a just relationship to emulate and put back into practice, but we also have in North America many people, many nations, many individuals who still understand what it is like to live in a respectful way to the natural environment, and who are standing up saying we're willing to share that knowledge with people in whatever forum that people want it to be shared in. Because they understand that they, like all of us, are affected by the decisions of those other people who are doing those things with that colonial capitalist mindset. And they want to be able to connect on that level too. So that level of connection is something I think that we all can participate in when we're thinking about ourselves as individuals, as people, and the choices that we make, the things we do or don't do, as people who are involved in government, people who are writers or thinkers or speakers or whatever. The connection and the learning and the building of that peaceful relationship and that trusting relationship between our communities will allow that information and that knowledge to flow. And that's really what's going to change this country, because I think that right now, the people that are in charge of the country, no matter what political party you're in, they're caught in a trap. The political system has created a dynamic that is impossible to escape. And it's going to take a crisis for people to come from that strata to come looking for answers. But people at our level can create that infrastructure that's different, that intellectual, that social, that political connection that is an alternative way to the one that is dominant in this society now, that can hopefully be something that people emulate moving into the future. And this time get it right, not like the United States and their use of our federal system. So that is what this idea of Indigenous resurgence is really all about. It's understanding colonialism as having all of these levels to which we're addressing only the surface, but it's inviting people in to a dialogue. It's inviting people into a relationship to recreate the existence, both in terms of a social reality and between our peoples, but also between the humans and the natural environment that actually existed for a long time in this country, and that I think is the only solution for the survival of this country and of the human race. Dane to. said I look forward to a dialogue and questions and comments, so I actually am very interested to hear what people have to say in reaction, or if you want me to elaborate on anything, or if you have any questions, or if you disagree. You know, part of our culture here is to have respectful disagreement too, and you learn from that. So if anybody disagrees with anything I've said, no harm at all. I actually look forward to the respectful engagement. Yeah.
So I'm picking up on something, one of the last things you said about being willing to show us and about our ancestors were indigenous, if I'm understanding it correctly, at some point, but that was erased. So is there, if we're willing to learn, is there a potential for awakening that knowledge in us?
You would be able to tell me that, because for me, in my experience of thus far, I would say up until about the last 5 years or 10 years or so, where there's been a big generational shift, I think, in terms of environmental ethics and just awareness of global problems and so forth, it's been very difficult. It's only through crises. When I wrote my book, Wasaze, in 2005, basically the political message in there was, there's no hope for this country and there's no hope for us unless we cause discord, unless we cause disruption, basically unless we confront the political system to create that break in people's mentality to make them realize that Canada's not perfect and that there needs to be a change. And so it was a prescription for social discord through political action. It didn't advocate violence, but it said we can organize to have a political disruption of the flow of the society so that there's a break, and in that break, then we take advantage of that. Intellectuals and allies, natives and allies, take advantage of that and show people that this is the reality. So that was in 2005. I still stand on that somewhat for the majority of the society. I think that they're just so, most people are just unquestioning. They do what's in their own individual interest. They have to feed their kids, they have their job, they do whatever, they don't question, they do it. And in that, of course, they're reinforcing. So there's that political strategic commitment that I still think is there, but over the last 5 or 10 years, and I think it is one of the results of reconciliation, I do find more and more people, or it may be actually the result of the growing awareness of the climate crisis and the environmental crisis, that more and more people are looking for answers. And so, like, when I first started, when I was a student, listening to all these elders and stuff, and I actually kind of dismissed it, when they used to say, oh, one day all the white people are going to come looking to us for answers. You know, oh yeah, you know, we have the answers, and well, you just see, watch, they're all going to come around one day, and they're all going to be asking us. Well, I mean, that is definitely what has come to pass. You know, I work at McGill, I've spoken all over the world at different universities, and 30, 40 years ago, people would be like, oh yeah, the remnants of history are here talking again. You know, I quote that all the time because I went to Cambridge in England, and Don, a professor, actually said that. Oh, good talk from a remnant of history. I only found out he said that after I left because someone told me. I don't think he would have said it to me, but he definitely said that. That was the attitude. Even here in Canada, UBC, University of Toronto, McGill, I've had people, I've given basically the same kind of talk. I was younger, so like more emphatic, yeah, more challenging, maybe a little bit more fire, you know, in attacking the ones who had power. 30 years ago, people stand up. I'm not listening to this, boom, out. Not joking, not exaggerating. Almost every time I gave a talk, people would stand up and say, I'm not listening to this crap, I'm out. Definitely not the case now. People are interested, people value, people are wanting, in a genuine way, to engage, to learn. I mean, I think there's still, in government circles, a lot of the, well, this is the era of reconciliation. and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody. I mean, I work with the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada. I give lectures at Global Affairs Canada and all this stuff. Yeah, some people are just doing it because they have to. You know, it's reconciliation, so they have to hire a native speaker, or they have to hire this guy to come and tell them what they already know, that kind of stuff. There's some of that. But more and more as I move around, I definitely see a genuine interest, and I think that this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to actually create that level of connection there. I saw it for myself most emphatically in the students that I had. I taught 26 years in a university, and most of the students that I had coming, I had to deny a lot of non-native students because I always wanted to keep a majority native student in a native course, you know, about a native culture. It would be odd if we only had like 1 or 2 natives and all non-native people. So we always had to kind of have a balance there. But so many non-native younger people very interested in learning about, in an authentic way, this indigenous way of being and knowing, almost too zealously, you know, wanting to take it. And so they have to learn the respectful engagement aspect of it, but the passion is there. And I definitely see that too in the work that I'm doing in the scholarly context continue. There's more and more people that are believing in the last point that I made, that the indigenous philosophy has answers that European and Euro-American philosophies don't have. And that connection that's still there, that knowledge that's embedded in the cultural ways of indigenous peoples is extremely valuable. And people are recognizing that and starting to want to engage. And so a lot of what I do now is actually teaching them how to engage respectfully, not to replicate the colonial attitude, to say like, oh, there's some valuable, you know, they know, and so I want that, and go take it and write a paper about it and then own it. You know, so the whole idea about research ethics and so forth, that's something that we're really working on now, is to have that connection made between allies and indigenous peoples and so forth, but have it reflect basically the treaty type relationship, that respectful coexistence, you know. So this is all connected, like the same philosophical principles underline the treaties as everything else that I'm speaking about here. And so, yeah, long answer to your question. Yes, I do see a lot of passion, and I do see more and more people, but on a collective level, I think that'll be for the society to decide in the coming years. Probably the next generation is going to have to really make some hard choices in terms of survivability versus maintaining the level of comfort and affluence that they have. And there's going to be some hard choices that have to be made. And hopefully we're around to be able to guide them and give them some framework for making a decision that's good for everybody. Yeah. Kev,
if I may ask, in your travels, how often have you heard other indigenous communities speak about the time that we're in terms of they will come to us when they're ready to seek? Mm-hmm. Like, I know that's a narrative here, but in your travels, do you come across that in other indigenous communities as well?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Again, it was something that I didn't take as seriously as I do now, ever since I've been engaged as a learner. And I shifted really from, I was raised on a reserve, raising Ganawage, full-on Mohawk, raising Ganawage, and then I left and I went into the United States Marine Corps, and I traveled around the world, and I didn't really care about, you know, our traditions or cultures all that much, like a young person often does. Then I came back. Ever since I got involved in educating myself about our tradition and our history and so forth, I've heard those things. And in reference to your question, much more so in other cultures than ours. And I think that's because in the East here, we've been involved since the 1970s, 60s and 70s in a resurgence, in a revitalization, in a reconnection. You know, we were our community, heavily Catholicized. Our language was at a very low point in the 1950s and 60s. All kinds of colonial attitudes and behaviors worked their way in and so forth. And so our culture has really been oriented on that concept of resurgence, of restoking the fire, restoking that fire of our nationhood and our culture. But if you go to other parts of the world, other parts of America even, that have not been affected as long or as in depth as us by those colonial forces, you see more of it. And I definitely have. And I'm talking about places like you go to New Mexico, you go to the Southwest, the Hopi are well known for having their prophecies and so forth. And I think it's because of their isolation. They've held on, and they've shared with us, and there's been mutual influence. But in our communities, it's been finding the resonance in our own language and culture of those things, and really revitalizing them. It's not been an unbroken, it's not been a straight unbroken inheritance. There's been a lot of resurgence, like I'd say, an active resurgence of traditions that had been broken or were partial or were suppressed at some point, but bringing them back to life. So that's why I like when I love hearing that phrase when I get my bio read, breathing life into their ancestral visions, because it's really about, here's our fire that had been almost extinguished, then you're blowing on the fire to get it strong again. You know, and that's what we've been involved in since the 1960s and 70s in our community. There's been families, there's been individuals who have held on to these things against all kinds of odds and all kinds of battering and racism and oppression, even by our own people. By our own people, you know, because the idea of progress and the racist ideas of colonization and the superiority of whiteness and white ways was so embedded in communities in the 1950s and 60s in our community today. Even our own people would put down those people who were holding on to our traditions. Now they're elevated. It's like a turnaround, eh? So just like I'm getting paid to come and talk to people about history. 40 years ago, 50 years ago, who would pay for a Native guy to come and talk about history? You know, and things have turned around, but look, that's the way things are going in our community as well, and that's why I can remain optimistic. Those communities, those nations that have held on have really, I think, done us all a great service in sharing those, and especially people like the Hopi and so forth that have maintained such a consistent and integral philosophical framework for understanding what it is to be Indigenous. They have influenced a lot of people. Not only Hopi, I'm just using that one example, but there's other nations as well. If you think about sweat lodges and where that came from with the Lakota, you know, sweat lodges have been very instrumental in the healing process of many people and still are. It's become a facet of our lives and all of ours, but we didn't have sweat lodge culture in the Haudenosaunee before the 1960s and 70s. That came as a gift from those people. Just like some of these songs and some of these principles and knowledge and principles of self-awareness and so forth that have come from others. They've connected with our communities, but without that breathing life into ours, it wouldn't persist. And so that's the relationship there with other nations. And so very much you can talk about it as an Indigenous movement on that level. Politically, everybody's divided, fighting amongst each other and undercutting like usual. We haven't yet come to a political unification or even solidarity, but on a spiritual and ceremonial and knowledge level, there's a great amount of sharing and connection between our peoples. I mean, it doesn't even really make sense. We jokingly talk about Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe arrivals and all this stuff, and we love to joke about that stuff, but so many of our ceremonies and our teachings and our songs and so forth cross over from each other. And so on that level of sustaining ourselves spiritually, there's been a lot of solidarity and unity. And it's one of the best things about being Ongwehongwe and Native is to know that and to go among those people and to feel that. And now it's expanding. Some people in our communities criticize. I'm sure you know, like, why are you sharing that with the non-natives, or why are you letting anybody come to your ceremonies and stuff? But that again is a reflection of that teaching. Like, they're going to need our teachings, and so there's a lot of the elders are much more open to sharing than some of the younger people that are still feeling like the anger and the resentment at being denied their language and culture. But again, the elders have a different perspective on it for the most part. Yeah. You can message me on Facebook after. Fred.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to push you on your vision of how Canada might work in this sense. And this is going to be a simple-minded question, but if there is a resurgence and Indigenous people regain their language and their culture and their customs and their values and everything else like that, that's what you've been talking about. How does that work in the context of Canada, which tends to have its customs European origins, right? So take something as simple as criminal law. You know, right now federal government says, here's what's a crime, here's the justice system, here's how you go through it. Presumably, if there's a resurgence, I mean, I'm guessing, but for all I know, there's going to be different values, different ways of looking at things like crime, punishment, and justice. So how in your vision of how Canada might work, what do we do? Do we have internal borders, or do we have two systems that work side by side, or is there some amalgam of the two systems?
Fred's a nuts and bolts guy. That's a nuts and bolts question. Very interesting one, though, and one that I've been grappling with, and many other people in our field have been grappling with for 30 years now. As long as there's been a movement for self-government, those are the questions that have been asked. And they're very good, real questions that need to be answered. The only answer I can give you, I'm not going to give you a kind of theoretical answer. I'll give you one in terms of practical examples that have worked, like in our community. It's guided by, like, our relationship with Quebec and Canada is guided by, from our perspective, this idea. One of the principles that I referred to, but I didn't name, was Degini Deahade, the two-row wampum. I don't know if anybody's ever seen the two-row wampum belt. It's a white belt with two purple rows. It's a very common symbol these days for good reason. It's a powerful symbol about respectful relationship. We live by that. And we ask Canada and we ask Quebec to live by that too, which is basically to say that we acknowledge that we are traveling down this pathway of history together, right? We're interdependent. But we also have to acknowledge the fact that we have our own existence and the right to choose to make best decisions for ourselves. So we're independent. So it's interdependence and independence at the same time. It's this two-row wampum where we're acknowledging our shared reality, but we're also asking each partner to respect the autonomy to the extent that that other party needs it and wants it in order to continue to exist. And so for our part, say with regard to policing, we have our own police force. Sorry. We have our own police force. We have our own Mohawk laws that somewhat are in a position of being different, as you say, to the outside laws, but a lot of times kind of overlap and are consistent. And what we're asking for is a respectful dialogue and an acceptance of the fact that there is no clear-cut template, that what this relationship is a constant negotiation, a constant, in the imagery that's been used in our culture, aside from the two-row wampum, there's another image of a chain. It's called a covenant chain. It was made with the British. So it's about the chain of friendship. And this, of course, came later than the two-row wampum, where silver chains were a thing among our people, and it was used as trade and so forth. And so the idea is that that chain always needs to be polished, like silver does. It needs to be polished, or else it's going to corrode. So if we're going to have a silver chain of friendship, if we're going to be bound together in this relationship, then we have to keep polishing the chain, which means we have to keep meeting. We have to keep dialoguing. So it's not an answer of a constitution or an MOU or an agreement in principle that says this is the way it's going to be and so forth. Yeah, you have the terms of a relationship, but you also acknowledge, and this is where it's fundamentally different in terms of government. What is your idea of government? Is it a contract form of government where you lay out, or is it where you're building a relationship and polishing that chain where you continue that relationship? So for years, our people, we needed to have our own police force because of the conflict of laws at the time in the 1970s and so forth. We asked the Canadian government and the Quebec government to support us. They didn't do it. They refused to support it because they weren't at the position yet of being able to recognize our nationhood, our autonomy. And so we did it on our own. We took money from other programs. Our policemen and women took less pay. But we wanted to assert ourselves as having the right and the capacity to have our own policing in our community. Over 15 years we did that. And then finally, once it was demonstrated that we could do that and do it effectively, Quebec government came and said, okay, well, now we want to negotiate. And they came and negotiated on our own terms. And so now we feel like we're in kind of a relationship that reflects that two-row principle of we've demonstrated that we are going to do policing the way we need to do it. And if it takes you 15 years to come to the point where you recognize that you're going to come and realize that it's benefit of all people in that area, in that physical space, then you're going to support it. And so for us, that's not the end solution. It may come a time when we're going to need a different type of relationship. But we want to have that dialogue. We want to have that respectful coexistence. And so that's the way it is for us. I don't think that there's any kind of cookie cutter. I don't think that there is a kind of solution. Granted, that is the norm because we're still operating in a governmental system created by the forms of governance that came from Europe and have established themselves here. But what we're advocating for is a different form of governance and different form of relationship. So on the other aspect of that question, I think it's a matter of which jurisdiction you're talking about, nuts and bolts guy. So which jurisdiction are you talking about? Because in some jurisdictions, they're very far apart. You know, the indigenous ethic and the indigenous principles and the indigenous laws and the ones that are in place here today, they're very far apart, and there's probably a vast distance there to cover to make that two-row relationship. I would say in environmental laws and so forth. But in criminal law, to use another example, they're pretty close. I mean, there's not all that much difference between what the Mohawks have to say about crime and punishment for capital crimes and for the whole run of most of the crimes that police deal with on a daily basis. It's just, there's not that much difference. And so it's an easy jurisdiction to kind of deal with. So
the punishment system is probably different. Can that coexist with the punishment system we have under the Canadian judicial system?
I don't know if it is different. It may have been different 300 years ago.
Connect with us by visiting our website or email us at comments@rogerstv.com.
This program is brought to you by Ignite TV. Now you're in command. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
Are you a passionate content creator ready to expand your audience reach? Do you have unique stories, captivating hobbies, or special interests that deserve a spotlight? Rogers TV is here to amplify your voice within the community. We offer you the platform to broadcast your content to a wider audience. And the best part, it's completely free. Don't miss this opportunity to share your vision and engage with viewers. Find out how Rogers TV can transform your content journey today.
Today, I helped a parent feed their family by connecting them to a food program.
Today, I helped someone connect with mental health supports.
Today, I helped a couple struggling to pay their bills access financial aid.
Every day, 211 navigators connect Canadians to critical government and community programs and services.
211. Help starts here.